Welcome back. Another interesting Seminole War video. And so this is a busy week for me. I have some events coming up. It's Veterans Day on Thursday, which for me is always a busy day. My American Legion post, see I'm wearing their t-shirt. They have a veterans breakfast at the American Legion Hall on Lake Ella in Tallahassee. Thursday morning, and then they have a veterans parade in downtown Tallahassee. So that should be interesting. This year we're needing a truck that can pull the trailer. So I guess one with the big electronic brakes or whatever, because it's a big trailer. Anyway, after that, this weekend at Dade Battlefield, and I'll be there, is the 100th anniversary celebration of Dade Battlefield State Park, Dade Battlefield Historic State Park. It was established and opened up, I think, July 7th, 1921. It's one of the older state parks at this point. It wasn't established by the Civilian Conservation Corps, although there was about 8 or 9 parks that were in Florida, but was the first Seminole War park in Florida. And it was over 50 years until any other ones were added, like Fort Foster, Fort Christmas, which is an Orange County park east of Orlando. And you have Paynes Creek commemorating the Panic of 1849 south of Bartow in the town of Bowling Green. So, for the longest, most expensive war the United States ever fought against its own Native American people, it really took a long time to get any recognition. Of course, now we have the Seminole War Heritage Trail, which you can download a brochure from the Department of State for free. So I want to talk about some interesting things I found in research. I like going through the newspaper archives and looking for eyewitness accounts. And this is an eyewitness account that talks about Dade Battle in Osceola. It's by a man named H.T. Blocker, and I had to look him up. And let's see if I can find, here it is. I found him on Find a Grave. Captain Haley Talbot Blocker says that he was a resident in Tallahassee for a long time. Died Wednesday, that's of course 1897, age 78, born in 1818 in South Carolina. Perhaps one of the oldest residents in Leon County, having resided nearly 60 years. Captain Blocker was a captain in the Seminole War, a major general in the old state militia, captain in the Confederate Army, and served throughout the late war under General Dickinson. Of course, General Dickinson and is famous as coming from, I think he had a house at Jacksonville or Amelia Island, but well known around Ocala, Marion County. Said that Mr. Blocker moved to Leon County in 1839, and that's important to know because that means what he describes in Dade Battle, it means he's not an eyewitness, even though he's describing it as such. So let's do another screen share. This is from the Florida Times-Union newspaper in Jacksonville, February 16th, 1895. This is 60 years after Dade's battle. It's more like 59, but anyway, close enough, 60 years. And this was on microfilm. This is not on the digital archives. You can't look this up anywhere. I had to go into the microfilm in the state library and found this. It says, massacre of Dade's men. Mr. H.T. Blocker corrects some false statements. Story of Clark, who escaped from the field. The Indians were led by a Negro named Abram. That's Abraham, of course. Osceola, Mr. Blocker says, was never in a battle. So that's interesting. Now, we have to keep in mind that memory is fickle and it gets changed around after 60 years. You get a lot of facts and details mixed around in your head. It's like putting it in a blender. So his memory is not always correct from 60 years, but it's interesting what he has. And I want to talk about this. Tallahassee, Florida, February 16th. I don't know, recent death of Louis Fatio at Jacksonville. Now he's talking about Louis Pacheco, who died in January of 1895. Louis Pacheco was the guide or the interpreter with Major Dade that survived the battle and was with the Indians for 2 years before surrendering to the Army. And he went out west. And they returned to Jacksonville and lived in the home, I think, of the daughter or granddaughter in New Switzerland, Florida. I think it's on the other side of the St. Johns River from Jacksonville. Says he's revived an interest in the Dade massacre. Many erroneous reports regarding it have been circulated, which should not be wondered at, considering that the tragedy occurred 60 years ago. Mr. H.T. Blocker probably knows more about the massacre than any man in Florida and has furnished the following for the Times Union. Now, keep in mind that this is Mr. Blocker's second or third hand information. He wasn't in Florida until 1839. And Mr. Blocker says, I've seen several articles in the newspaper in regard to the massacre of Major Dade and his command in Sumter County, Florida on the 28th December, 1835, in which much has been said about the command which were given by several officers during the struggle, all of which is so absurd that I feel constrained to give a true version of the sad affair as related to me by Mr. Clark, one of the parties who made his escape from the battlefield and found his way to Fort Brooke in Tampa. The 1st of February, 1836, I arrived in Tampa. Okay, so I did arrive in Florida in 1836. He probably moved to Tallahassee in 1839 and there met Mr. Clark very often and on several occasions had conversation with him in regard to what occurred on that fateful day on the 28th of December, 1835. Of course, Clark was shot 5 times at the battle, in which he never recovered and died 5 years following. And so Ransom Clark's probably hanging around Fort Brooke. Oh, and let's go to the next slide. Mr. Clark's story. Version of the massacre is as follows. On the morning of the 28th, Major Dade was attacked by Indians while we were breakfasting on the margin of a small pond, now known as the Breakfast Pond, and our command soon drove the enemy off. We then resumed our march, seeing occasionally an Indian, but never getting sufficiently near to fire upon one of them. Now that's very interesting. Before the battle, the night before, the command camped 4 miles south at a place called Breakfast Pond. And here, according to Mr. Blocker, was that as they were packing up, getting ready to leave, they were fired upon. But apparently it wasn't much of a battle because they don't mention getting any casualties. We continued our march until about 12:30 p.m. when we arrived at a pond known as the Dinner Pond. So you have the Breakfast Pond, and you have the Dinner Pond, where the command was halted for dinner. It was in open pine forest with small bushes and salt meadows on the north side, about 50 yards from our halting place. And there is a pond to the east of the battlefield. I've never heard of it referred to as the Dinner Pond before. And he is describing it correctly that we have from the different maps and accounts being of open pine forest with saw palmetto around the place. We know that's true. As we anticipated an attack every moment, we were ordered to stack our arms, which sounds strange. If you're going to be attacked, you don't stack your arms. A detail was ordered to fell some pine trees as a breastwork, but few trees had fallen when there was a yell, and simultaneous from the bushes and palmettos, a sheet of fire from the rifles discharged by the Indians when at least one half of the command was killed or wounded at the first volley, and among them, the most of the officers. And so this is a little bit mixed up because we know from other accounts from Ransom Clark and that the soldiers were fired while marching on the road, and after they charged, did an infantry charge, and the Indians backed off. Then the soldiers built the breastwork, and the Indians returned about 45 minutes later, and they were fired again. But this, of course, we're listening a different side of the story. Still interesting there. Oh, and notice it says discharged rifles discharged by the Indians. There's a difference between rifles and muskets. Muskets usually mean smoothbore muskets. Rifles can be muzzle loaders, but they have rifling in the barrel. So that means the Indians have rifles instead of muskets. I just saw that interesting because Henry Prince in his diary mentions that. I saw Major Dade fall at the first volley, being near him. I was severely wounded and being thrown prostrate. I began to crawl on my hands and knees to the rear. The surprise and confusion was so great I could hear nothing but the yells of the savages and the sharp crack of their rifles. I heard no command given by any officer. I continued to crawl, getting further and further away until coming to a small patch of palmetto. I crawled into and hid myself until sunset. And that's a different report than Frank Ulmer writes about Ransom Clark, where he's in the line and he's injured, and he eventually ends up in the breastwork, kind of buried in the bodies, and kind of has to work his way out after sunset. On finding I could walk, I again made a way towards Tampa Bay, where I arrived on the evening of the fourth day after the massacre, exhausted and sore and stiff from my wounds and nearly starved. That's about all I know of the matter. Of course, there's a lot more detail in some other articles, but Ransom Clark was shot in the hip, and it's hard to imagine that he'd just get up and walk unless he just had superhuman willpower. The article continues. It says Perpempino's story. The story is related by Antonia Perpino, who received it from Jumpa some of the time subsequently, is substantially as follows. Who the identity of this person is, probably Antonio Proctor, who was in Florida and lived in Tallahassee, may have met Mr. Blocker in Tallahassee. They might have even known each other. Antonio Proctor died in 1855, about 115 years of age. So he got the name wrong, and he gets some of the details, but this is interesting what Antonio Proctor said. On the morning of Dade's massacre, Chipko attacked him at the breakfast pond and was repulsed after a loss of several of his warriors. Chipko then sent a runner to Abramstown, a few miles distant, with a request to Abram to bring all his men and meet him at the point designated, and on the route he expected Dade to travel. Abram responded promptly with quite a number of warriors. A runner was also sent to Jumper, but he being absent on the Withlacoochee River, Jumper's son with a few old men joined Chipko. Abram, a Negro, and Chipko, finding that Dade was traveling on the trail, which passed the dinner pond, placed their men in ambush in the Salm Palmetto and underbrush and awaited Dade's approach. Unfortunately, the command of Dade halted to noon and bivouacked where the massacre occurred. This is interesting because there is two Chipkos in the Seminole War. One of them went to Oklahoma and one of them stayed in Florida. They're apparently brothers, but this is kind of the first reference that one of them was involved in Dade's battle and attacked at the breakfast pond. But this is the only account we know of being attacked at the breakfast pond. And they ran to Abrahamstown, which is about 8 miles from Dade's battlefield. Abrahamstown, Palekaha. And after the Seminoles finished off the soldiers, the Abraham's people and the Black Seminoles came in and finished off the soldiers after the Seminoles left, or as the Seminoles were leaving. There's some difference of opinion, but according to Antonio Proctor, Abraham was leading the attack and Jumper wasn't there. Another account, Jumper was there commanding. It would make sense that Jumper would be commanding the battle because his town was the closest town there and you fight for your home. Also, it was not hard figuring out where Dade's men would go because they're on the Fort Gang Road. They knew where they were marching to. Abraham the Negro was in chief command at the request of Chipko. Jumper said that a short work was made of the whole affair as the Indians had 3-1 and that their first fire so demoralized the command of Dade that the rest was only a killing. Many things as trophies were taken by the Indians as well as scalps. Okay, so Jumper's talking like he was there. So was he there or wasn't he there? We don't know. And opinions differ whether the Indians took trophies or scalps. Ethan Allen Hitchcock denies that, said they had fallen exactly where they were shot and died and were not scalped. It's debatable whether they were scalped or looted. We imagine if there was any musket cartridges or ammunition left, the Indians probably took that. But there's at least $300 taken off the soldiers by General Gaines's command when they arrived 8 weeks later. Abraham the Negro, who led the Indians, I know well. He was a man about 5 feet 8 inches in height, broad shoulders, large head and small black eyes, and weighed about 200 pounds. So a bit heavy set for a guy 5'8". I have heard through Antonio Perpino, that's Antonio Proctor, that Abram had for some time served with Lafitte on the Baratarian coast, and with him Lafitte at the Battle of New Orleans. After leaving New Orleans, he came to Florida and joined the Seminoles, over whom he exerted a wonderful influence. He accompanied the delegation who were taken west by Major Fagan to look for homes assigned them according to the stipulation of the Treaty of Payne's Landing. This, I think, was in 1832, that they went west. And he's kind of mixing up some of the details between Abraham and Antonio Proctor. Some of the story, and there's no way to verify it, is that Antonio Proctor was the one who was with John Lafitte at the Battle of New Orleans. Actually, Lafitte was not present at the Battle of New Orleans, but he provided ammunition, musket flints to Jackson, and his men were running the artillery. So it's kind of mixing up some details between Abraham and Antonio Proctor. Let's see what he says about Osceola. This is very strange here. Much as was been said and written about Osceola or Powell is that he is lionized more than Indian or half-breed ever existed. First by John T. Sprague, who wrote a book on the history of the Seminole tribe or the Seminole War, he means, and selected the half-breed Osceola as here. His Osceola's true history and origin to about the followers, according to the story related to me by Antonio Perpino, who knew well his origin. Osceola's father, whose name was Powell, was an Irish sailor who deserted his ship at Savannah, Georgia, and made his way south, meeting with a small band of Creek Indians going south. Okay, stop right here. What we have heard from James McQueen, who had started the band that Osceola was with, is actually how he joined the Creeks, is that in reality, James McQueen deserted the British ship at Savannah, some people say Charleston, and made his way until joining up with Perrymanstown on the Chattahoochee River. And so here he's saying it was William Powell. They're talking about the Englishman Powell, or here they say it's Irishman, took up with an Indian squaw for a wife, by whom he had one child, the boy Osceola. The squaw who he took for a wife was allied in no respect to any chief or family of note. Therefore, Osceola had no claim or authority as a chief or a sub-chief. I recollect well when he was with Major Thompson, agent of the Seminoles, that Osceola hung around his quarters and acted more as a lackey for said agent than anything else, going on errands, cleaning his boots, etc. So that's kind of an insulting description. Now, Osceola's mother, Polly, actually did have some good matriarchal connections. Her sister, Betty Durant, was very renowned in the Creek band. So, the Proctor gives some strange details. Hostility began in the fall of 1835. Previous to the outbreak, the principal chiefs called a council of war, and majority of chiefs were for open hostility and war to the death with the whites. Charlie Emathla, who was the son of Onate Emathla, principal chief of the Seminoles before his death, a great friend to the whites, strenuously opposed going to war. The council just about dark adjourned. Emathla was on his way home when he was waylaid and murdered by Abram, the Negro, Micanopy, Sam Jones, and Jumper. For fear of the friends of Emathla, the murderer or assassins charged Osceola with the crime, making him the scapegoat, knowing that he had but few friends. And that's interesting. He's talking about Charlie Emathla, who sold his cattle to the whites to immigrate to the West. And because the Seminole Council had declared a death sentence on anyone who does that, is that Osceola supposedly carried out the sentence of execution. I think the chief he's son of, there's a Oti Emathla, which is Jumper. There's also Halati Emathla, which was the main Seminole chief who actually did go west, and I believe died shortly of arriving at Fort Gibson. But here he says that Charlie Emathla is not murdered by Osceola. He is murdered by Abraham, Micanopy, Sam Jones, and Jumper ganged up on him and killed him. So, boy, this is different from any other account you'll ever hear. He says Osceola, never in battle, sometime after Major Thompson, the agent, was murdered by the same parties, Abraham being the leading spirit of this felony, and they again charged Osceola with the crime, which so frightened Osceola that he left that part of the country fearing for his life. No, wait a minute. Thompson was killed by Osceola the afternoon of the 28th. The morning of the 28th, the battle started at Dade Battle with Abraham, Micanopy, and Jumper there, and maybe Sam Jones. We don't know about Sam Jones, but here he has killing Thompson. They can't be in two places at once. So that's kind of gives evidence to prove that there might be some details that are off. It says, okay, talking about Osceola, he found his way across St. John's River, where he joined a small party of refugee Indians whom he remained until captured and taken to Charleston and incarcerated at Fort Moultrie, where he died. Osceola was never in a battle, never had a following, and it's strange that because he is a half-breed, he should have been so lionized. And of course, at least Osceola was captured with at least 80 warriors. And so apparently he was a little more of a leader than they give him credit here. And so it says Osceola was never in a battle, but he was seen specifically in a battle, the Battle of Withlacoochee, first battle of the Withlacoochee, 3 days after Dade's battle. One of the officers recognized him there. So he was at least in half a dozen battles that we know from eyewitnesses. I knew him personally. His habits were bad, but not vicious. When supplied with whiskey, he would get drunk. He had a wife and 2 children, but his wife, like his mother, was allied to no one in authority. The greatest part of this history was given to me by Antonio Perpino. That's Antonio Proctor, who is an intelligent, truthful man and one who, in every opportunity, knowing the facts as inherent related. Antonio Perpino, a colored man, was a native of the Isle of Jamaica, one of the British possessions, and when at the age of 15 or 16, was taken by a British officer as a lackey and brought to the colonies. Then in Revolution, he was at the Battle of Bunker Hill and several other battles. On leaving for Europe, the vessel on which Perpino sailed touched St. Augustine, where he begged to remain, where he lived for many years. Being a good linguist, he was often sent with dispatches by the governor of the fort of St. Mark's. He spoke Spanish, French, and all the language of the Creek and Seminole and Cherokee Indians. He died in Tallahassee in 1866 at the ripe old age of 119 years. He was a gentleman in every sense of the term. A truly good man was Antonio Perpino, and honor to his race, peace to his ashes. Now, he's talking about Antonio Proctor, which died in 1855, I believe, but who was a free man. He was a free black in a slave state, very well respected. Antonio Proctor, he had translated for the Seminoles, and the government, not sure if he got paid for all of that, but he lived in Tallahassee. His son, I think his son George, was well known. There's still some buildings in Tallahassee that were built by his son. And then his son ran off to the gold rush in California and never heard from again. Had a granddaughter, Letty Proctor. And so Antonio and Letty are, I think, are buried in the old cemetery. I don't think there's a marker for where Antonio is buried. Both Antonio and Letty Proctor attended the square grounds in the Busk in this area. And what I'm told from a very old gentleman who knew Letty Proctor personally and spoke at her funeral. So they were not only allies to the Seminoles, they were practitioners, as we shall say, of the traditional ways. So anyway, okay, no more screen share. So that is just so different from any other accounts of Dade battle and Osceola, and mixing up the facts between Abraham and Antonio Proctor. That was just a little too much, but these are the hazards that you have to run across while researching. That, you know, I could tell you some of the backstory on who they were mixing up, like where they were mixing up some of the details of Abraham that really go to Antonio Proctor, or William Powell. They're crediting some accounts that are really James McQueen, and all those things have been thoroughly researched by other people. And so Mr. Blocker, resident Tallahassee's working off 60-year-old memory. He was not present at Dade's battle. And so he's going from memories, not from any documentation. So you have to be careful what you read, even though it may have been an eyewitness. It doesn't necessarily mean it's reliable. And also, he heard everything from secondhand sources by people who may have been there and not something he heard himself. So I hope you found this interesting. Come to Dade Battlefield on Saturday from 10 to 4, I believe it is. And we can talk history. Hope to see you then.